Macbeth, the Storybook edition, a fresh take on the classic play by William Shakespeare, written by Raymond Davy, spoken by Alex Inglewood. Before we dive in, I would love for you to subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss out on any new stories as they're released, and it helps support more content like this. Now, sit back, relax, and join me as we begin our journey into the world of Macbeth. Chapter 1: A Prophecy in the Fog. The storm rolled in with a ferocity that could only be described as theatrical. Thunder crashed, lightning slashed the sky, and the rain fell in sheets so thick it seemed as though the heavens themselves had lost their patience with the land below. Somewhere in the Scottish highlands, 3 old women shuffled through the muck, swathed in dark, ragged cloaks that did little to protect them from the relentless rain. "These damn rocks," muttered the first woman, a crone with a face so wrinkled it resembled a crumpled map of the region. She went by the name Aggie, though to call her that was to assume she was fond enough of anyone to allow them such familiarity. "I swear they weren't here last time." "If you'd kept to the path," replied the second, her voice a dry, raspy whisper that suggested she'd spent a good portion of her life yelling at misbehaving spirits, "you wouldn't be complaining about rocks. But no, Aggie wants to take the scenic route again." "Shut up, both of you," snapped the third witch, slightly younger and significantly sharper-tongued than her companions. She wielded authority like a rusty dagger, old, dangerous, and not entirely reliable. Her name was Hester, and her patience was as thin as her hair. "This isn't a Sunday stroll, and we're not here for your bickering." Aggie rolled her eyes. "Oh, Hester, you're no fun anymore. Remember the old days when we'd turn a man into a toad just to see if he'd hop off a cliff? Now that was entertaining." "Some of us prefer subtlety," replied Hester coolly, though even she couldn't help but smirk at the memory. The third witch, whose name nobody quite knew, or if they did, they weren't foolish enough to speak it aloud, had been listening with a look of deep concentration, as though pondering the mysteries of the universe, or at the very least, trying to decide whether she wanted stew or roast raven for dinner. "Let's get this over with," the nameless one said. "He'll be here any moment." "Who?" asked Aggie, her eyes widening with the spark of someone who liked to be in the know. "We're meeting someone?" "The future king, you half-wit," Hester hissed. "Ah, yes," Aggie nodded wisely, as though this information had been at the forefront of her mind the whole time. "What's his name again?" "Macbeth," replied Hester, her eyes narrowing in the direction of the approaching road. "Captain Macbeth of Glamis." "Oh, that one," Aggie muttered, adjusting her hood. "The tall one with the weird chin. Got it." As if on cue, the rumble of hooves approached, muffled by the relentless downpour. The witches fell silent, their eyes glinting in the darkness. Through the sheets of rain emerged 2 figures, their cloaks heavy with mud and weariness. The man leading the horse had the distinct look of someone who had seen too much blood for one lifetime, and the sword hanging by his side suggested that he was far from finished. "Foul weather we're having," said Macbeth, addressing the witches with the casual air of a man greeting old acquaintances in the middle of nowhere. His voice was deep and gravelly, tinged with exhaustion but not without humor. He was wet, tired, and thoroughly miserable, and yet he seemed almost amused by the absurdity of his situation. "Indeed," replied Hester, her voice taking on an eerie resonance that was probably meant to be intimidating. "It wasn't. All the better for prophecy." Macbeth raised an eyebrow at this, but didn't comment. His companion, Banquo, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "Are we in for a fortune-telling then?" he asked with a grin, though there was a wary edge to his tone. "Why else would we stand in the rain?" replied Aggie, cackling as though this were the most obvious thing in the world. The witches circled the 2 soldiers, who exchanged dubious glances. Macbeth looked more annoyed than anything, while Banquo's skepticism was matched only by his curiosity. The witches stopped, facing their audience with expressions that suggested this wasn't their first performance, but they were prepared to enjoy it all the same. "Macbeth, Thane of Glamis," Hester began, her voice thick with portent. "You are destined for greatness, though the path will be paved with blood." "Well, that's vague," Banquo muttered under his breath. Macbeth shot him a warning look, and Banquo held up his hands in mock surrender. All right, I'll keep quiet. Thane of Cawdor shall you be, Aggie continued, taking up the chant, and king hereafter. Macbeth blinked, surprised by the specificity. He couldn't decide if he was amused or unsettled, but either way, he felt the pull of something dark and unspoken. Cawdor? He asked. There's already a Thane of Cawdor. Details, details, murmured Aggie with a wave of her hand. We're more interested in the future. The future? Banquo interjected, unable to contain himself. And what of me? Aggie and Hester exchanged a glance, and the nameless witch smiled. You'll be the father of kings, she said, almost cheerfully, but not a king yourself. Well, isn't that just fantastic? Banquo muttered, trying to mask his disappointment. My children get all the glory, and I get what exactly? The witches ignored him, turning back to Macbeth with the air of someone who had imparted all the wisdom they were willing to share. Hester leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as she spoke her final words. Beware what you wish for, Macbeth. Power comes at a price. And with that, they turned and began to shuffle away, disappearing into the fog as abruptly as they had arrived. Macbeth and Banquo were left standing in the rain, more confused than enlightened. Well, that was weird, Banquo said after a moment of silence. Do you think they were serious? Who knows, replied Macbeth, still staring after the witches. His mind was racing, thoughts colliding like storm clouds. Thane of Cawdor, king, father of kings. The words lingered in the air, heavy with possibility and the scent of something darker. Perhaps they're just mad. Or perhaps they're onto something, Banquo countered, his tone laced with irony. You know, prophecies have a way of coming true when you're not looking. Or when you're looking too hard, Macbeth muttered, the words barely audible over the storm. He shook his head, trying to dispel the feeling of unease that had settled over him like a second cloak. Let's get out of this cursed weather. As they mounted their horses and continued on their way, the rain seemed to ease, as if the storm had spent itself on that brief, cryptic encounter. The fog lingered, though, swirling in the wake of the retreating witches. It was as if the landscape itself held its breath, waiting to see what would come of this whispered promise of power. Somewhere in the distance, hidden by the thick fog, the witches cackled quietly amongst themselves, sharing a private joke that only they understood. And perhaps, just perhaps, the storm wasn't quite finished after all. Chapter 2. Seeds of Ambition. Macbeth rode in silence, his cloak now less heavy with rain, but twice as heavy with thoughts. Beside him, Banquo hummed an old drinking tune, poorly and off-key, a habit he claimed kept spirits, both literal and metaphorical, at bay. If he noticed the weight of Macbeth's mood, he chose to ignore it, preferring to lighten the journey back to camp with nonsensical lyrics and the occasional, very unconvincing bird call. Banquo, Macbeth finally muttered, breaking the silence. What do you make of it? Macbeth asked, though his voice lacked conviction, as if he wasn't entirely sure he wanted an answer. The witches, Banquo replied. Well, if you ask me, they're either wise women with a knack for metaphors or really committed pranksters. Macbeth didn't answer. He was too busy trying to piece together the jagged puzzle of their predictions. Thane of Cawdor? He shook his head, brushing off the notion as the ramblings of some eccentric old crones. But still, Banquo, noticing the distant look on his friend's face, decided to press on. Look, if they really are predicting futures, it seems to me that you got the better end of the deal. Thane of Cawdor, king, and all that. He chuckled, but there was a note of unease beneath it. Meanwhile, I'm apparently just fathering a dynasty and getting no credit whatsoever. You're taking this rather well, Macbeth observed, his voice tinged with irony. What? The prophecies? Oh, I've always said, aim low with your expectations and you'll never be disappointed, Banquo replied, adjusting his saddle with an air of resignation. I figured if my biggest achievement is creating heirs who outshine me, at least someone will finally appreciate my jokes. Macbeth almost smiled at that. Almost. They rode on, the campfires of Forest Castle flickering in the distance. The smell of roasted meat drifted through the air, a reminder that not everything in their world was rain and blood. There were small comforts after all, hot meals, dry clothes, the occasional night without a murder. As they reached the gates, a messenger approached at a gallop, his face a mask of urgency. "My lords," he called, his voice carrying an excitement that suggested the wine cellar might have been raided earlier that evening. The king awaits you both. What news? Macbeth demanded, his curiosity too piqued to let this messenger ramble on about irrelevant pleasantries. News, sir, of your bravery, the messenger exclaimed, almost tipping his helmet in his eagerness. And of the traitor Cawdor. Macbeth's brow furrowed. Cawdor? The word seemed to hang in the air, heavy with implications he wasn't ready to face. What of him? Hanged, sir, the messenger declared with grim enthusiasm. The king has stripped him of his title, and, here he paused dramatically, as if he'd rehearsed this bit all the way from the throne room, bestowed it upon you, my Lord Macbeth. Banquo gave a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered. Those old women were on to something. Macbeth felt as though the world had shifted slightly beneath his feet, like the ground wasn't entirely convinced it wanted to hold him up anymore. Are you certain? He asked, his voice quiet, almost drowned out by the crackling torches. As certain as the gallows stand, my lord, the messenger replied with a flourish, clearly proud of the news he bore. Banquo leaned closer to Macbeth and murmured, You're not going to faint, are you? No, Macbeth replied, though he felt slightly unsteady. No, I'm fine. Well, good, Banquo said, clapping him on the shoulder. Because if you're king one day, I'd hate for history to remember your coronation starting with you collapsing in a puddle. The king's hall was a stark contrast to the dark road they had left behind. Warm, bustling, and reeking of roasted venison, it was the kind of place that made one briefly forget about the battles and the betrayals. The fire crackled with a cheerfulness that felt out of place given the circumstances, and King Duncan himself sat at the head of the room, smiling as though he hadn't a care in the world. Ah, my noble Macbeth, Duncan called as the two men entered. You've returned from the field victorious. Your Majesty, Macbeth said, forcing a smile that was only slightly strained. We merely did our duty. Nonsense, Duncan replied, waving a hand dismissively. You did far more than that. I owe you my life, and my kingdom owes you its loyalty. There was a murmur of approval from the gathered lords, and Macbeth couldn't help but feel the weight of their eyes on him. This should have been a moment of pride, perhaps even joy, but all he felt was a curious mixture of dread and expectation, as though the world were holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. And in recognition of your service, Duncan continued, I name you Thane of Cawdor, in place of the traitor. The room erupted in applause, though Banquo leaned in close and muttered, Now would be a good time to look gracious, or at least less confused. Macbeth nodded mutely, his mind racing. Thane of Cawdor. It was as if the witches had simply rewritten reality to match their words. The thought both thrilled and unnerved him in equal measure. As the evening wore on, the festivities began to blur into a haze of laughter, feasting, and wine-soaked congratulations. Macbeth's mind, however, was far from the merriment around him. The witches' words echoed in his ears, merging with the king's praises into a cacophony of whispers, all of them urging him towards something he wasn't quite ready to name. Well, you've had quite the day, Banquo remarked, swirling his wine in a gesture that suggested he was more sober than anyone gave him credit for. Prophecies, titles, all this attention. I dare say, if you find a pot of gold by morning, you'll have a full house. Luck has a strange way of finding me, Macbeth replied, though his voice was distant, distracted. Or perhaps you've just stumbled into the part of the story where things get interesting, Banquo suggested with a grin. In which case, I hope you've got a good plot twist up your sleeve. Macbeth chuckled, though there was no mirth in it. We shall see, he said quietly, more to himself than to Banquo. From across the hall, Lady Macbeth watched her husband with narrowed eyes, a calculating expression on her face. She could sense the change in him, the shift in his demeanor, and she knew, with the certainty of a spider watching a fly approach its web, that something was brewing. For now, though, she kept her distance, biding her time. There would be plenty of moments to push her husband's buttons and plant the seeds of ambition more firmly in his mind. After all, as far as she was concerned, the throne was there for the taking, if only someone were willing to reach out and grab it. And if there was one thing she knew about her husband, it was that he was a man who could be made to reach. With the feasting still raging around them, the echoes of prophecy and fate lingered in Macbeth's mind, like a whisper in the dark promising power at a terrible cost. The future loomed before him, shrouded in fog and blood, and he could almost hear the witch's laughter in the distance, carried on the wind like a mocking reminder of what was yet to come. Chapter 3: The Fatal Decision. The fires had long since died down when Macbeth returned to his chambers, but the castle still hummed with life. The echoes of laughter and drunken song reverberated through the stone corridors, a distant reminder of the evening's festivities. Macbeth's head throbbed with the after-effects of wine, exhaustion, and something he could only describe as an uncomfortable awareness of his own thoughts, like the unsettling feeling of being watched, except the watcher was inside his skull. Lady Macbeth, as always, was waiting. She stood by the window, looking out into the night with a patience that seemed at odds with her usual demeanor. When she heard the door close behind him, she turned, eyes narrowing slightly as she assessed the state of her husband. There was something in her expression, an eagerness perhaps, but sharper, like a blade half drawn from its sheath. "Well?" she asked, breaking the silence. "How did our king enjoy his evening?" "Our king," Macbeth echoed, letting the words roll around in his mouth as if trying to get used to the taste. "He was gracious." "Gracious?" Lady Macbeth raised an eyebrow. "You look as though he served you poison instead of praise." "He named me Thane of Cawdor," Macbeth replied, the words tumbling out almost unwillingly. He stared at her, waiting for some acknowledgement of the gravity of this revelation. "Just as the witches said." "Did he?" Lady Macbeth's eyes gleamed, her lips curving into a smile that was as predatory as it was pleased. "Well, that's convenient, isn't it?" "Convenient," Macbeth echoed, feeling like he was losing track of the conversation. It was a common feeling around his wife, and he didn't particularly enjoy it. "Yes, convenient," she replied, as if explaining something to a rather slow child. "It means that those old crones might not be entirely mad, and if they were right about Cawdor..." She let the thought hang in the air, like a noose waiting for a neck. Macbeth shifted uncomfortably. He knew where this was going, and he wasn't sure he wanted to follow. "It's just talk," he muttered, almost as if trying to convince himself. "Stories and riddles?" "Stories and riddles?" Lady Macbeth repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "They spoke of kingship, Macbeth. Your kingship. Or do you think fate bothers itself with idle gossip?" He didn't respond immediately. His mind was churning, filled with half-formed thoughts and a nagging sense that he was standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying. "It's not right," he said finally, though even he could hear the lack of conviction in his voice. "Duncan is our king. He trusts me." Lady Macbeth let out a sharp, almost disbelieving laugh. "Trusts you?" she repeated, shaking her head. "Oh, my love, you're either very naive or very drunk. Perhaps both." "He does," Macbeth insisted, though his voice wavered. "He honored me tonight." Lady Macbeth's expression softened slightly, but there was a hard edge beneath it, a razor wrapped in velvet. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And what of your ambition?" she asked, her tone coaxing, almost gentle. "Where does that fit into your loyalty and honor?" "Aye," Macbeth began, but he didn't have an answer ready. Lady Macbeth studied him, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "You want more than just praise, don't you?" she said quietly. "You want the crown. I see it in your eyes every time you look at that man sitting on your throne." "He's not," Macbeth started to protest, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Don't lie to me," she snapped, her voice a whip crack in the quiet room. "Not to me, of all people." Macbeth fell silent, staring at her as though seeing her for the first time. There was something almost frightening about her intensity, the way she could see through him as if he were made of glass. And yet, there was something thrilling about it too. This sense of shared purpose, this dark current running between them, pulling them both towards a common goal. "What would you have me do?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Lady Macbeth smiled, a small, satisfied smile that sent a shiver down his spine. "I would have you seize what is yours," she replied. "Take the crown, Macbeth. Make yourself king as fate intended." "King?" he repeated, the word heavy on his tongue. "How?" Her eyes gleamed with a dangerous light. "Duncan comes here tonight," she said, her voice low and full of conspiracy. "To our castle, under our roof. Think of it, Macbeth. He trusts you. He comes here with no guard, no suspicion." Macbeth felt a chill run down his spine. He understood what she was suggesting, but he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. You want me to kill him?" he asked, the words almost catching in his throat. "Do you want to be king?" she countered, her voice as sharp as a dagger's edge. "Or do you want to spend the rest of your life playing the loyal subject, watching as others take what should be yours?" Macbeth swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He felt as though he were standing at the edge of a precipice, staring down into a dark, yawning abyss. "I don't," he began, but she interrupted him again, her patience wearing thin. "You hesitate," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You hesitate and you doubt. This is not the man I married." "Perhaps the man you married wasn't meant to be a murderer," Macbeth retorted, some small spark of defiance flaring up within him. Lady Macbeth's eyes narrowed, and for a moment he thought she might strike him. But then she smiled, a cold, calculated smile that made his blood run cold. "You're right," she said softly, almost tenderly. "The man I married wasn't meant to be a murderer. He was meant to be a king." Macbeth didn't know what to say to that. He felt as though he were caught in a trap, unable to move in any direction without getting tangled further in the web she had spun. And the worst part was, a part of him wanted to believe her, to believe that this was his destiny, that he was meant for something more than just serving another man's ambition. He began, but the words wouldn't come. Lady Macbeth took his hand, her grip firm and unyielding. "Leave the details to me," she whispered, her voice as smooth and dangerous as silk. "I'll make sure everything goes according to plan. All you have to do is be ready." Macbeth stared at her, his mind racing. It was madness, pure, unadulterated madness. And yet there was a dark, undeniable allure to it. A promise of power, of greatness, of fulfilling the destiny that had been whispered to him in the rain-soaked night. "All you have to do," she repeated, her voice soft and coaxing, "is be ready." And in that moment, Macbeth made his fatal decision. He didn't say it out loud, he didn't need to. The look in his eyes was answer enough. Lady Macbeth smiled, a smile that was equal parts satisfaction and triumph. "Good," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Very good." Outside the window, the wind howled, and the storm clouds gathered once more, as if nature itself were bearing witness to the choice that had been made. Somewhere far off in the distance, the witches cackled softly to themselves, pleased with the way their little game was unfolding. And in the shadows of the castle, unseen by any mortal eyes, the seeds of ambition took root, waiting to grow into something far darker and more terrible than anyone could imagine. Chapter 4: A King's Unnatural Demise. The hours that followed were a blur of whispered plans and silent movements, like a dance in the shadows where each step was a potential misstep, and each misstep a potential disaster. Lady Macbeth moved with a quiet efficiency, issuing instructions to the servants with a smile that was as thin as the edge of a knife. She was calm, unnervingly so, as if this were a routine dinner party rather than a prelude to regicide. Macbeth, on the other hand, was not calm. He paced their chambers, trying to steady his hands and failing miserably. He muttered to himself under his breath, his thoughts running in circles as he wrestled with the enormity of what he was about to do. "If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly," he murmured, trying to convince himself that speed was the key. He knew he was rambling, but the sound of his own voice was at least a distraction from the silence that pressed in on him like a smothering cloak. "But if—" "Oh, for the love of God, stop muttering," Lady Macbeth snapped as she entered the room, startling him out of his thoughts. "You're going to wear a hole in the floor with all that pacing." Macbeth stopped mid-step, looking at her with the wide-eyed expression of a man who has just been caught stealing from the cookie jar, except the cookies in this case were a king's life and the throne of Scotland. "I'm preparing," he said weakly. Lady Macbeth gave him a look that suggested she was reconsidering their entire marriage. "You're dithering," she corrected. "And dithering doesn't win kingdoms. Are you a man or not?" "That's an interesting question," Macbeth replied, his voice wavering slightly. "I feel like my manhood is under a lot of scrutiny this evening." Lady Macbeth sighed deeply, as if she were dealing with a particularly dim-witted apprentice. "Macbeth, listen to me very carefully," she said, enunciating each word with the precision of a knife's edge. "The plan is simple. You go into Duncan's chambers, you stab him, Once or twice, no need to get creative. And then you come back here, and we blame the whole thing on his guards. It's not complicated. It's not complicated, Macbeth repeated, as if trying to convince himself. Right, not complicated. She gave him an exasperated look. For heaven's sake, you've killed men before, haven't you? Not like this, he muttered almost petulantly. It's different. Different? She repeated, her voice dripping with incredulity. How is it different? Well, for one thing, those men were usually awake at the time, he replied, his voice rising slightly in his agitation. And they were trying to kill me first. It's a whole different dynamic. Lady Macbeth stared at him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to laugh or throttle him. Macbeth, she said, her voice unnervingly calm, if you lose your nerve now, I swear to whatever gods are listening that I will. But whatever dire threat she was about to make was interrupted by a knock on the door. Both of them froze, their eyes widening like children caught sneaking a peek at their Christmas presents. After a tense moment, the door creaked open, and a young servant stuck his head in. "Begging your pardon, my lord, my lady," the servant said nervously, clearly sensing that he had walked in on something he shouldn't have. "The king has retired for the night and sent his thanks for your hospitality." "Ah, yes," Lady Macbeth said, her voice as smooth as silk and twice as deadly. "Thank you, that will be all." The servant hesitated, his eyes darting between the two of them, as if trying to determine whether he should be more worried about Macbeth's wild-eyed expression or Lady Macbeth's too bright smile. After an awkward pause, he bowed and retreated, closing the door behind him. As soon as the door clicked shut, Lady Macbeth rounded on her husband. "Well," she demanded, "what are you waiting for? An engraved invitation?" Macbeth swallowed hard, his throat dry. He felt as though he were standing at the edge of a cliff, and every instinct screamed at him to turn back. But then he remembered the witch's words, the promise of power, of kingship. It was there, within his reach, if only he had the courage to grasp it. "Aye," he began, but his voice failed him. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "I'll do it." Lady Macbeth's expression softened slightly, just slightly. "Good," she murmured, almost tenderly. "Be bold, Macbeth. Be the man you were meant to be." With that, she handed him the dagger, its blade gleaming faintly in the candlelight. Macbeth took it, feeling the weight of it in his hand. It was heavier than he expected, or perhaps it was the weight of what it represented. He stared at it for a moment, trying to summon the courage to move. "Go," Lady Macbeth urged, her voice low and urgent. "Do it quickly, before you lose your nerve again." Macbeth nodded, his jaw set. He turned and left the room, moving with the slow, deliberate steps of a man marching to his own execution. The corridors of the castle seemed darker than usual, the shadows deeper and more oppressive. He felt as though the walls were closing in around him, squeezing the air from his lungs. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own heartbeat, which seemed to echo off the stone like the tolling of a distant bell. When he reached Duncan's chambers, he paused outside the door, his hand shaking as he raised the dagger. He could hear the king's soft snores from within, and for a moment he almost turned back. But then he remembered Lady Macbeth's words, and the image of her disappointed face was enough to make him grit his teeth and push the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from a flickering candle on the bedside table. Duncan lay asleep, his face peaceful, utterly unaware of the danger lurking just a few feet away. Macbeth took a step forward, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. "Is this a dagger which I see before me?" he whispered to himself, staring at the blade in his hand. "Or just a really inconveniently timed hallucination?" The dagger, predictably, didn't answer. Macbeth shook his head, trying to clear the fog from his mind. "It's just a piece of metal," he muttered. "Just a piece of metal." He took another step, his eyes fixed on the sleeping king. He could do this. He had to do this. It was the only way to... Duncan shifted in his sleep, and Macbeth nearly jumped out of his skin. He froze, holding his breath, waiting for the king to wake. But Duncan merely mumbled something incoherent and rolled over, oblivious to the impending doom. "Get a grip, Macbeth," he whispered to himself. "You're acting like a child scared of shadows." He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to do. He raised the dagger, his hand shaking, and, "Oh, for God's sake, just stab him already!" came a loud whisper from behind him. Macbeth nearly dropped the dagger in shock. He turned to see Lady Macbeth standing in the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression one of exasperation. "What are you doing here?" he hissed. "Supervising," she replied flatly. "Clearly you need the encouragement." Macbeth began, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Just do it," she muttered, her voice somewhere between a command and a plea, "before you give both of us an aneurysm." Macbeth hesitated for a moment longer, and then, with a swift motion, he plunged the dagger into Duncan's chest. The king gasped, his eyes snapping open, but it was over almost as quickly as it had begun. The life faded from Duncan's eyes, and the room was plunged into silence once more. Macbeth stared at the blood on his hands, feeling a strange mix of triumph and horror. He had done it. It was done. Lady Macbeth stepped forward, her expression a mixture of relief and impatience. "Well?" she asked. "Are you going to stand there all night, or are you going to plant the evidence?" Macbeth blinked, as if coming out of a trance. "Right," he muttered, moving mechanically to smear the blood on the guards' weapons. His hands were steady now, almost numb, as if the enormity of what he had done hadn't fully sunk in yet. When it was finished, they slipped out of the room and back into their chambers, moving with the silence of thieves in the night. Lady Macbeth closed the door behind them and let out a long, shaky breath. "It's done," she murmured, almost in disbelief. "It's done." Macbeth didn't respond. He was staring at his blood-stained hands, his mind racing. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of a precipice and the ground was crumbling beneath him. Lady Macbeth glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "Come, my love," she said gently, taking his hands in hers. "We're safe now. It's over." But even as she spoke the words, they both knew it wasn't true. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. In the distance, the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, bathing the castle in a pale, cold light. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of mortal eyes, the witches watched and laughed, their voices carried on the wind like a mocking whisper. It was only the beginning. Chapter 5. Paranoia and Power. It was official. Macbeth had become King of Scotland, though he hardly felt like it. The crown sat awkwardly on his head, like a hat he hadn't quite grown into, and the throne seemed more uncomfortable than the hard wooden chairs of his soldier days. But there it was, he was king, and that should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like a punishment, a heavy, pointy, and entirely inconvenient punishment. The trouble, Macbeth soon discovered, wasn't in becoming king, it was in staying king, because with the crown came not just power, but suspicion, and suspicion was a relentless, insomniac companion. "If you keep pacing like that," Lady Macbeth remarked one evening, watching her husband wear a groove into the floor of their chambers, "you're going to turn this castle into a carnival ride." "I'm not pacing," Macbeth muttered, not breaking stride. "Yes, you are," she replied dryly. "You're wearing a path straight to madness." Macbeth stopped, though not because her words reassured him. The fact that she had so accurately predicted the state of his mental health was, in itself, deeply unsettling. "It's Banquo," he said quietly, his eyes darting towards the window as if expecting to see Banquo lurking outside, peering in like a curious, judgmental owl. "Banquo?" Lady Macbeth raised an eyebrow. "Banquo, your old friend and most loyal general?" "Banquo, my old friend and most suspiciously insightful general," Macbeth corrected, running a hand through his hair. "He was there when the witches made their prophecies. He knows too much." Lady Macbeth sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that suggested she was beginning to regret the entire regicide thing. "So what if he knows?" she asked, her voice laced with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "What's he gonna do, accuse you of treason?" "Yes," Macbeth snapped, as if the answer were obvious. "Or he could gather a small group of loyal men and overthrow me, or poison my wine, or write a passive-aggressive poem implying I stole the throne." Lady Macbeth blinked. "That last one seems unlikely." "You never know," Macbeth muttered darkly. "Poetry is a dangerous weapon in the right hands." Lady Macbeth rolled her eyes. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Macbeth, Banquo is not a threat." "He is," Macbeth insisted, his voice rising in pitch as his paranoia took hold. "The witches said his descendants would be kings. What if he's plotting to overthrow me so he can fulfill that prophecy?" "Macbeth," she said slowly, as if speaking to a very small and confused child, You are the King of Scotland. If Banquo were to overthrow you, the last thing he would be worried about is his descendants' royal aspirations. But Macbeth wasn't listening. He was too busy muttering to himself, trying to piece together the fragments of his own fractured logic. Lady Macbeth watched him with a mixture of pity and irritation, wondering if this was really the same man she had married. A man who used to face battlefields without flinching, but now seemed afraid of his own shadow. "Macbeth," she said sharply, cutting through his rambling, "if you're that worried about Banquo, then do something about it." Macbeth paused, blinking at her as if the thought had never occurred to him. "Do something about it?" he repeated, his voice faint. "Yes," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "You're the king now. You have power. Use it." "But what?" "Hire some men," she interrupted, as if this were the most obvious solution in the world. "Deal with him before he deals with you." Macbeth stared at her, and she could see the wheels turning in his head, creaking and groaning like the gears of an ancient, unreliable clock. It took a moment, but eventually a twisted sort of clarity settled over his face. "You mean, have him killed?" "Yes, Macbeth," she said patiently. "That's exactly what I mean." "But he's my friend," Macbeth said weakly, though even he didn't sound convinced. Lady Macbeth let out another deep, exasperated sigh. "You had a king murdered in his sleep, and now you're balking at the idea of removing one troublesome friend?" "It's not the same," he protested, but the words rang hollow. He knew it wasn't true. In fact, he wasn't sure what was true anymore, or whether that even mattered. Truth, it seemed, was a luxury for those not burdened by ambition. After a moment of tense silence, Macbeth squared his shoulders and nodded. "All right," he said, as if he had just made the most difficult decision of his life again. "I'll do it." Lady Macbeth nodded approvingly, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, something dark and sad and almost regretful. She turned away, hiding her expression from him as she spoke. "Good," she murmured. "Now stop pacing and go deal with your paranoia like a proper king." Later that night, Macbeth met with two rough-looking men in a shadowy corner of the castle courtyard. The men had the unmistakable air of professional thugs, the kind of men who probably kept detailed records of their beatings and had annual evaluations to ensure their intimidation skills were up to snuff. "You're sure you can handle this?" Macbeth asked, his voice unsteady. The taller of the two men, a grizzled veteran with a scar running down one cheek, gave Macbeth a bemused look. "You hired us to kill a guy," he said bluntly. "That's pretty much our entire skill set." The other man, shorter but equally intimidating, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, we're not exactly in the baking business, if you catch my drift." "Oh," Macbeth replied, though he didn't quite understand. "Well, good. Just make sure it's done quietly." The taller man nodded. "Discreetly, of course. He'll be dead as a doornail by tomorrow." "Just get it done," Macbeth muttered, feeling distinctly out of his depth. As the two men slunk off into the darkness, Macbeth felt a strange mixture of relief and dread settle over him. He had taken action, yes, but that action came with consequences. Consequences he wasn't entirely sure he could control. And so, as the hours ticked by and the castle fell silent, Macbeth lay awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sound of his own breathing. He could almost hear the whispers of fate echoing in the back of his mind, taunting him with the knowledge that one choice always led to another, and another, and another, until there was no turning back. Somewhere, far away, the witches were watching with gleeful anticipation. They could sense the threads of their prophecy tightening around Macbeth like a noose, and they relished the chaos that was slowly consuming him. "Well, this is turning out even better than I expected," Aggie muttered to Hester, who nodded in agreement. "Men are so predictable." Hester replied, her voice laced with dark amusement. "Give them a little taste of power and they'll do the rest themselves." "Shame, really," said the nameless witch, her tone far more cheerful than the words warranted. "He could have just retired to a nice little estate in the countryside, grown old and fat, and lived happily ever after." Hester snorted. "What fun would that be?" Aggie cackled quietly, her eyes glinting with mischief. "None at all, dear. None at all." And so, as the witches laughed and the shadows lengthened, Macbeth's paranoia deepened, creeping through the corridors of his mind like a slow, relentless poison. The seeds of ambition had taken root, but the fruit they bore was bitter indeed. It was only a matter of time before the ghosts of his choices came back to haunt him. Chapter 6: The Banquet and Banquo's Ghost. As King Macbeth's reign continued, the royal castle bustled with activity. No one seemed to question the new king's legitimacy, not openly at least. Most people were content with the free-flowing wine and the occasional feast, and Macbeth made sure to throw grand banquets whenever the murmurs of discontent got a little too audible for comfort. The night of the banquet was no different. The great hall was filled with laughter, the smell of roasted meats, and the chatter of lords and ladies who had perfected the art of feigned interest. Goblets clinked, plates clattered, and the servants moved about like silent, long-suffering shadows. In the center of it all sat Macbeth, dressed in royal garb that somehow managed to look both regal and uncomfortable. He wore a strained smile that suggested he was trying very hard to appear relaxed while internally debating the merits of running away to join a monastery. "Are you feeling all right?" Lady Macbeth asked through gritted teeth as she adjusted her own elaborate gown. She was smiling broadly at the guests, but her tone was sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm fine," Macbeth replied, also smiling broadly, though his eyes were darting around the room like a cornered rat's. "Perfectly fine." "Then stop twitching," she hissed. "You look like you're planning on setting the place on fire." "I'm not twitching," he muttered, even as he adjusted his collar for the 5th time in as many minutes. "Macbeth," she whispered, her voice low and dangerous, "you are a king. Act like one." Macbeth nodded stiffly, attempting to project an air of calm authority. Instead, he resembled someone trying very hard not to sneeze. He raised his goblet and cleared his throat. "My lords and ladies," he called, his voice only slightly wavering. "A toast, if you will." The guests quieted down, turning their attention to the king. Macbeth glanced at Lady Macbeth, who gave him an encouraging nod that was more of a command than a gesture of support. He took a deep breath. "To our great kingdom," he began, "and to all who serve it, may we prosper and continue to be prosperous." Lady Macbeth winced. There was a polite smattering of applause, and the guests raised their goblets in response. Macbeth took a long, fortifying drink, trying to ignore the fact that his speech had been about as inspiring as a wet sock. Things seemed to be going smoothly, which should have been Macbeth's first warning sign. Whenever things were going smoothly, something was inevitably lurking in the shadows, waiting to ruin everything. And tonight, that something was Banquo's ghost. Macbeth had almost managed to convince himself that everything was under control. The murder of Banquo, which he had orchestrated with grim determination, was a necessary evil, a way to protect his throne and secure his future. The deed was done, and Banquo was out of the picture, or so he thought. As the evening wore on, Macbeth felt a strange chill in the air. It wasn't the kind of chill that came from an open window or a drafty hall. No, this was the kind of chill that seemed to seep into your bones, whispering unsettling things in the back of your mind. He glanced around nervously, trying to shake off the feeling, and then he saw him. Sitting at the far end of the banquet table, in a chair that should have been empty, was Banquo. He was dressed in the same attire he had worn on the night of his murder, only now it was stained with the unmistakable marks of blood and betrayal. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy, and his expression was one of mild disappointment, as if he'd just realized he'd missed an important meeting. Macbeth froze, his goblet slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. What is this?" he stammered, his voice barely audible over the din of the banquet. Lady Macbeth turned to him, her smile fixed in place, but her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Macbeth," she whispered urgently. "What's wrong?" Macbeth didn't answer. He was too busy staring at Banquo's ghost, who was staring right back at him with an expression that seemed to say, "Really, Macbeth? This was your big plan? Who put him there?" Macbeth demanded, his voice rising in panic. He pointed a shaking finger at the empty chair, or at least what everyone else thought was an empty chair. "Put who where?" Lady Macbeth asked, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Him!" Macbeth shouted, jabbing his finger at the chair. "Banquo, he's sitting right there!" The guests exchanged confused glances, their murmurs growing louder. Lady Macbeth gave a strained laugh, the kind that sounded like it was being forced through clenched teeth. "Ah, our king is quite the jester, isn't he?" she said, her voice dripping with false cheer. Always playing tricks on us. No trick, Macbeth insisted, his voice cracking. He was now pointing both fingers at the ghost, who seemed to be enjoying the show immensely. He's right there! Lady Macbeth leaned in close, her smile never wavering. Macbeth, she said in a voice so low it was practically subterranean, there is no one there. Stop making a fool of yourself. But, Macbeth began, only to be cut off by Banquo's ghost, raising a single, blood-stained finger to his lips in a shush gesture. Macbeth's eyes widened. He glanced around frantically, expecting someone else to see what he was seeing. But the guests were all staring at him with expressions that ranged from bemusement to outright concern. He's mocking me, Macbeth muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He's mocking me. Lady Macbeth sighed deeply, a sound that conveyed both resignation and a fervent desire to strangle her husband. Our king is simply tired, she announced to the room. He has been working tirelessly for the good of our realm. I'm sure he would appreciate a moment to collect himself. The guests nodded politely, though their expressions suggested they were seriously reconsidering their allegiance to this new and deeply unstable monarch. Macbeth, Lady Macbeth hissed, grabbing his arm and dragging him to the side of the hall. Get a hold of yourself. I can't, he whispered, his voice shaking. He's right there. He's looking at me. Lady Macbeth glanced over her shoulder at the empty chair, then back at her husband. There is no one there, Macbeth, she said slowly, as if trying to explain basic arithmetic to a particularly stubborn child. You're imagining things. I'm not, Macbeth insisted, though the tremor in his voice suggested even he wasn't entirely sure anymore. He's right there. Lady Macbeth closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if summoning every ounce of patience she had left. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. Let's say for the sake of argument that Banquo's ghost is sitting at our table. What are you going to do about it? Apologize? Macbeth began, but he quickly realized he had no idea what he was going to do. He was a king, yes, but he was not equipped to handle spectral guests, particularly ones who seemed intent on silently judging his life choices. Exactly, Lady Macbeth said, her voice clipped. Now go back out there, sit down and stop making a scene. Macbeth took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded. He turned back towards the banquet table, his heart pounding in his chest. Banquo's ghost was still there, watching him with a look that seemed equal parts amused and disappointed. Slowly, Macbeth walked back to the table, trying to project an air of calm authority. He sat down, his hands shaking as he reached for his goblet. Banquo, he muttered under his breath, his eyes fixed on the ghost. It wasn't. Banquo's ghost raised an eyebrow, as if to say, Really, Macbeth? That's your defense? Macbeth swallowed hard, trying to muster up something, anything, that would make this situation less horrifying. But before he could speak, Banquo's ghost slowly, deliberately, stood up and began to walk towards him. Macbeth's blood turned to ice. He stared, frozen in place, as the ghost advanced, its expression now one of grim determination. I didn't mean, Macbeth began, but the words caught in his throat. And then, just as Banquo's ghost reached him, the spectral figure leaned in close and whispered a single word, Boo. Macbeth let out a strangled yelp, nearly falling out of his chair. The guests gasped, the murmurs turning into full-blown whispers of alarm. Lady Macbeth buried her face in her hands. Oh, for God's sake, she muttered under her breath. Banquo's ghost chuckled softly, its voice echoing like distant thunder, and then it vanished, leaving Macbeth sitting there, pale and shaking, with the entire hall staring at him. Well, said one of the lords, breaking the stunned silence, this is certainly the most memorable banquet I've attended in some time. There was an awkward laugh from the guests, and the tension in the room began to dissipate, just slightly. Lady Macbeth forced a smile and raised her goblet. To our king, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil beneath the surface. The guests hesitated for a moment, then raised their goblets in response. To the king, they echoed, though there was an unmistakable note of unease in their voices. Macbeth forced himself to smile, though it felt more like a grimace. As he took a shaky sip of his wine, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were rapidly spiraling out of control. And somewhere, in the shadows of the hall, the witches watched with delight, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of seeing their prophecies take root. See? Aggie whispered to Hester. "I told you this would be fun." Hester nodded, a grin spreading across her face. "Oh, it's only just beginning." And with that, they vanished into the darkness, leaving the new king to grapple with his crumbling sanity, his spectral visitors, and the growing realization that power was a far heavier burden than he had ever imagined. Chapter 7. The Tyrant's Downfall. If paranoia were a crown, Macbeth would have been wearing it at a jaunty angle by now. Days after Banquo's ghost crashed the banquet, he was still grappling with the fallout. His reputation in the court was wavering, and whispers were circulating like a persistent draft in a crumbling castle. Yet it was not these murmurs that weighed on Macbeth's mind. It was the lingering question of what exactly the witches were up to. The witches, meanwhile, were having a grand time watching their prophecy unravel. The three of them had set up camp on a hill overlooking the castle, like demented birdwatchers, waiting for Macbeth's downfall to get interesting. "You know," said Aggie, adjusting her shawl as she peered down at the castle through a pair of rusted opera glasses. "I half expected him to hold it together longer than this." "Really?" replied Hester, who was lazily stirring a pot that was probably not intended for soup. "He's a man in a power crisis. That's like putting a cat in charge of a room full of mice and expecting it not to overcomplicate things." The nameless witch, who was sharpening a very unnecessarily large pair of shears, gave a casual shrug. "If it makes you feel better, his wife's not doing much better. She's seeing spots everywhere." Hester let out a snort of amusement. "Oh, that's priceless. Spots. It's always spots." They cackled softly, a sound that drifted down the hill and sent shivers through the unlucky sheep grazing nearby. They were in no hurry. After all, fate had its own pace, and they were in this for the long game. Meanwhile, inside the castle, Macbeth was desperately trying to maintain an air of authority while dealing with increasingly bizarre visions. If Banquo's ghost hadn't been enough, he now found himself catching glimpses of other unsettling things. Shadows that seemed to watch him, reflections that moved independently of their owners, and, on one particularly stressful occasion, a rather accusatory-looking loaf of bread. Lady Macbeth, for her part, was handling the situation with all the grace of a person trying to steer a ship through a hurricane, using only an umbrella and strong language. She was seeing the cracks forming in their carefully constructed facade, and her patience was wearing thin. "Macbeth," she said one morning, in a voice that was meant to be calm but came out somewhere between a hiss and a growl. "We need to talk." "About what?" Macbeth asked, his eyes darting suspiciously around the room, as if he half expected Banquo to jump out of the curtains. "About your public breakdown," she replied, her tone clipped. "You've been shouting at chairs, staring at bread, and having entire conversations with thin air. People are starting to notice." "I'm not shouting at chairs," Macbeth muttered, clearly offended by the suggestion. "I was interrogating them." Lady Macbeth closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if trying to center herself in the midst of a particularly chaotic storm. "Whatever you call it, it's not exactly kingly behavior." "Well, what would you have me do?" Macbeth demanded, his voice rising in agitation. "Pretend everything is fine?" "Yes," Lady Macbeth said through gritted teeth. "That is exactly what I would have you do." "I can't just pretend," he muttered, rubbing his temples as if trying to knead the tension out of his skull. "There's too much going on." "You mean the hallucinations?" she asked dryly. "They're not hallucinations," he snapped, a little too loudly. Lady Macbeth shot a quick glance at the door, half expecting a curious servant to be lurking outside. It's those witches," Macbeth continued, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "They're playing games with me." "Macbeth," Lady Macbeth said slowly, as if explaining basic geometry to a toddler, "the witches didn't make you kill Duncan, or Banquo, or order those two guards to, well, you know." Macbeth's eyes widened. "I didn't." "Oh, spare me," she interrupted. "You think I don't know what you've been up to? I practically handed you the daggers the first time. Do you really think I'm that dense?" Macbeth stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He had never been good at winning arguments with his wife, but this one was particularly disheartening. Before he could muster a response, there was a knock at the door. Lady Macbeth sighed heavily. "Come in," she called, her voice flat with resignation. A servant entered, bowing awkwardly. "Your Majesties," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "There's a visitor." "Not now," Macbeth snapped, waving his hand dismissively. "But, sir," the servant continued, undeterred by Macbeth's apparent unraveling, "the visitor says she's a prophet." Macbeth blinked. "A prophet?" he repeated. "What kind of prophet?" The servant hesitated, clearly unsure of how to describe what he had seen. Well, sir, she's wearing quite a lot of feathers, and she insists she has a message for the king." Lady Macbeth's eyes narrowed. "Feathers?" "Yes, ma'am," the servant replied, looking thoroughly uncomfortable. Macbeth exchanged a glance with Lady Macbeth, who seemed to be weighing the pros and cons of allowing another potential supernatural element into their already overcomplicated lives. "Oh, fine," Macbeth muttered, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "Send her in." The servant bowed and hurried out, and a moment later, the doors swung open to reveal an old woman dressed in a frankly absurd number of feathers and trinkets. She swept into the room with all the grandeur of a monarch, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "Ah, King Macbeth," she said in a voice that was simultaneously soothing and deeply unnerving. "I come bearing news of your future." "Of course you do," Lady Macbeth muttered under her breath. "Why wouldn't you?" The woman ignored her, focusing her gaze on Macbeth. "Beware, O king," she intoned, her voice taking on a melodramatic lilt. "For the forces of fate are closing in around you. Danger lurks where you least expect it." Macbeth stared at her, clearly trying to decide whether to be terrified or impressed. "Danger?" he repeated. "What sort of danger?" "The kind that walks on two legs, speaks in riddles, and carries vengeance in its heart," she replied cryptically, as if that explained anything. Macbeth rubbed his forehead, feeling a headache coming on. "Could you be more specific?" She shook her head solemnly. "Specificity is the enemy of prophecy, Your Majesty. But know this, Birnam Wood is on the move." "Birnam Wood?" Macbeth echoed, looking thoroughly confused. "The forest?" "Yes," she said, nodding gravely. "The very same." Macbeth and Lady Macbeth exchanged a look of utter bafflement. "How exactly does a forest move?" Lady Macbeth asked, her voice flat with disbelief. "The ways of fate are mysterious," the woman replied, sounding deeply pleased with her own vagueness. "You'll see." Macbeth sighed heavily, feeling the weight of his crown pressed down on him. "Is that all?" The woman considered this for a moment, then leaned in closer. "Also," she whispered conspiratorially, "you might want to double-check your pantry. There's a very accusatory loaf of bread in there." Macbeth's eyes widened. "I knew it," he muttered, half to himself. Lady Macbeth, on the other hand, looked like she was ready to scream. With a final dramatic flourish, the woman turned and swept out of the room, leaving Macbeth and Lady Macbeth standing in stunned silence. "Well," Lady Macbeth said after a long pause, "this just keeps getting better." As the days passed, Macbeth's paranoia only deepened. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, expecting the trees outside his window to start marching up to his doorstep with pitchforks. Lady Macbeth, meanwhile, was doing her best to hold everything together, though her patience was wearing thin. One evening, as Macbeth sat brooding in his chambers, the door creaked open, and one of his loyal aides entered. "My lord," the aide said, his voice trembling slightly, "there are reports of movement in the forest." Macbeth's head snapped up. "What sort of movement?" he demanded. "The kind where the trees appear to be, well, moving," the aide replied hesitantly. Macbeth stared at him, his mind racing. He could hear the witch's words echoing in his head, mocking him. Birnam Wood was on the move. The forest was coming for him. "Of course it is," he muttered, standing up and grabbing his sword. "Because why wouldn't the forest come for me?" "What are you doing?" Lady Macbeth asked, appearing in the doorway with a look of exasperation. "I'm going to go fight the forest," Macbeth replied grimly, as if this were a perfectly reasonable response to the situation. Lady Macbeth stared at him for a long moment, then let out a defeated sigh. "Fine," she said, throwing up her hands. "Go fight the forest. But if you lose, don't expect me to come rescue you." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Macbeth to face the impending threat of an apparently vengeful forest. And somewhere, hidden in the shadows of Birnam Wood, Macduff and his allies were preparing their final assault, chuckling to themselves as they watched the increasingly paranoid king's descent into madness. "Think he'll actually come fight the trees?" one of Macduff's men asked, his voice tinged with amusement. "Oh, I wouldn't put it past him," Macduff replied with a grin. "He's lost his mind completely by now." And so, as the forest closed in and Macbeth's fate drew ever nearer, the witches looked on with delight, reveling in the chaos they had set in motion. They had set the stage, and now the final act was beginning. "Well," Aggie said with a satisfied sigh, "this has certainly exceeded my expectations." Hester nodded in agreement, a wicked grin spreading across her face. "And the best part is, it's not over yet." With that, they vanished into the mist, leaving Macbeth to face his destiny, one that was shaped not just by prophecy, but by his own fatal ambition. Chapter 8: The March of Birnam Wood. It was not the sight of an army that startled Macbeth, nor the clamor of weapons being readied. No, what caught the newly self-appointed king completely off guard was the appearance of a small forest inching its way towards the castle. From his vantage point on the castle's outer wall, Macbeth rubbed his eyes in disbelief. It wasn't every day that a collection of oak and pine trees decided to go for a walk, but there they were, marching in tight formation as if they were the most disciplined grove in all of Scotland. "Is that?" Macbeth muttered to himself, trailing off as he squinted at the approaching line. "Are those trees?" One of his guards, who had been peering through a spyglass, swallowed hard. Yes, sire." Macbeth turned to him with wild eyes. "Birnam Wood?" The guard, who had taken to biting his nails, nodded. "It certainly appears that way, sire." "By God!" Macbeth whispered, feeling the blood drain from his face. They actually did it. The realization hit him like a cartload of bricks. The witches had said Birnam Wood would come to Dunsinane, and here it was, strolling casually up to his castle. He had thought it was some kind of metaphor, a poetic exaggeration to be taken with a grain of salt. Now he realized that maybe taking prophecies literally wasn't such a bad idea after all. "What do we do, my lord?" asked the guard, who looked like he was considering a swift career change to sheep farming. Stay calm," Macbeth replied, trying to sound authoritative while actively fighting the urge to scream. "How many are there?" "Trees, sir." The guard glanced through his spyglass again. "I'd estimate a forest's worth." "Great," Macbeth muttered. "That's just great." Meanwhile, down in the forest that was now an army, Macduff and his soldiers were enjoying the irony of the situation immensely. They had cut branches from the trees to use as camouflage, and now they were marching up the hill with all the stealth of a troupe of amateur actors performing A Midsummer Night's Dream for the first time. "I have to hand it to you, Macduff," said one of the soldiers, a burly man with a less than scholarly look about him. "This is the strangest plan I've ever been part of." "Well," Macduff replied with a grin, adjusting the branch he was holding, "if you're going to topple a paranoid tyrant, you might as well have a little fun with it." Another soldier chuckled. "I just hope he's not too sharp-eyed. These branches are doing a poor job of making me feel invisible." "Don't worry," Macduff said. "From what I've heard, Macbeth's sanity has all the structural integrity of a wet loaf of bread. He won't know what's happening until we're knocking on his front door." Back in the castle, Macbeth was pacing furiously, muttering to himself in a tone that suggested he was just one existential crisis away from addressing inanimate objects again. Lady Macbeth, who had made a brief appearance to assess the situation, was less than impressed. "You're telling me that the forest is on the move?" she asked, her tone flat and disbelieving. "Yes," Macbeth snapped. "Look for yourself." Lady Macbeth sighed heavily and leaned out the window, taking in the surreal scene below. After a moment, she turned back to Macbeth with a look that seemed to encompass several emotions, none of them particularly positive. "You know," she said slowly, "if you had just listened to me and stopped shouting at furniture, we might not be in this position." "I didn't shout," Macbeth muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "And I had perfectly good reasons to be suspicious of those chairs." Lady Macbeth pinched the bridge of her nose, taking a deep breath. "Macbeth, I am exhausted. You're exhausted. And now we're about to be attacked by a literal forest. Can we agree that perhaps this whole thing has gotten a bit out of hand?" Macbeth didn't answer. He was too busy staring out the window, watching the advancing army of trees with mounting horror. "It's the prophecy," he muttered, almost to himself. "The witches, they knew this would happen." "Yes," Well, witches aren't exactly known for their straightforward honesty, Lady Macbeth replied dryly. You're dealing with people who put eye of newt in their soup for fun. Do you really think they were rooting for you? Macbeth didn't respond. He was too busy hyperventilating. Lady Macbeth sighed again, turning to leave. I'm going to go find some wine, she muttered. Try not to do anything rash while I'm gone. With that, she swept out of the room, leaving Macbeth to stew in his own paranoia. He stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to steady himself. Then he straightened, his eyes narrowing with renewed resolve. No, he muttered, as if talking to some unseen force. I won't let it end this way. I am the king. I am invincible. The problem with convincing oneself of invincibility, of course, is that reality rarely cares about internal pep talks. As Macbeth rallied his troops and prepared for battle, the forest-turned army continued its steady march up the hill, led by Macduff, who was grinning like a man who had just won a particularly clever bet. Remember, men, Macduff called over his shoulder, the element of surprise is on our side. Well, that and the fact that our enemy is completely losing it, one of his soldiers replied, struggling to keep his branch upright. Honestly, at this point, I half expect him to start arguing with his own reflection. You joke, Macduff said, but you haven't seen his reflection. It's a surprisingly convincing conversationalist. The soldiers laughed, their spirits lifted by the absurdity of the situation. It wasn't every day you got to storm a castle dressed as a tree. The battle that followed was a chaotic blend of fear, confusion, and surreal absurdity. Macbeth's troops, already on edge from their king's increasingly unhinged behavior, were completely unprepared for the sight of an army emerging from a forest in perfect formation. What is this? One of Macbeth's guards stammered, his voice trembling as he watched the advancing line of branches. It's some sort of tree trickery, another guard replied, sounding distinctly panicked. Hold your ground, Macbeth bellowed, raising his sword in what he hoped was an inspiring gesture. They may look like trees, but they bleed like men. It wasn't the most eloquent battle cry, but it got the point across. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to stem the rising tide of panic among his troops, who were starting to question whether this was the kind of job they had signed up for. As the armies clashed, Macbeth found himself face to face with Macduff, who was brandishing his sword with the confidence of a man who had been waiting for this moment for a long, long time. Macbeth! Macduff called, his voice ringing out above the din of battle. Today, you face your doom, Macbeth sneered, raising his sword. Do your worst, traitor, he spat. No man born of a woman can harm me. Macduff raised an eyebrow. Is that so? He asked, his tone almost conversational. Well, funny story, I wasn't exactly born in the usual way. Macbeth blinked, his sword faltering. What? Caesarean section, Macduff clarified with a grin. Bit of a technical loophole, wouldn't you say? Macbeth stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish that had just been informed it was on the menu. You're kidding, right? Afraid not, Macduff replied, his grin widening. So if you'd like to rethink your strategy, now would be the time. Macbeth felt a cold chill run down his spine. The witches had tricked him, twisted their words just enough to lead him down this path, and now here he was, facing a man who was apparently a walking technicality. Well, Macbeth muttered, his voice resigned. Isn't that just typical? And with that, the two men clashed, swords flashing in the dim light. It was a fierce, desperate battle, with both men fighting not just for victory, but for their own sense of purpose and pride. In the end, though, fate had already chosen its victor. Macbeth, exhausted and wounded, fell to the ground, his sword slipping from his grasp. He stared up at Macduff, who stood over him with a look of grim satisfaction. I suppose, Macbeth wheezed, a bitter smile playing at the corners of his mouth. This is what they call irony. Something like that, Macduff replied, raising his sword for the final blow. Goodbye, Macbeth. And with that, it was over. As the dust settled and the castle fell silent, the witches watched from their distant hilltop, their eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. Well, Aggie said, leaning on her staff, I must say, that was quite the show. Hester nodded in agreement. It had everything: betrayal, madness, walking trees, and loopholes, the nameless witch added with a grin. I do love a good loophole. They laughed softly, their voices carried away by the wind as they faded into the mist. Their work here was done, but they knew that the cycle of ambition, power, and downfall would continue long after they were gone. For now, though, they were content to let history take its course. After all, there were other kings to topple, other destinies to twist, and other mortals to toy with. And as they vanished into the darkness, the castle of Dunsinane stood as a silent reminder of the price of ambition, and the folly of trusting in prophecies delivered by cackling old women with a penchant for chaos. Chapter 9. The Final Showdown. Macduff stood in the courtyard of the castle, the battle around him slowly winding down as Macbeth's last loyalists either surrendered or ran away at top speed in a display of Olympic-level cowardice. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, sweat, and the not-so-subtle irony of fate. As Macduff surveyed the aftermath, his sword still dripping with the blood of the would-be tyrant, he couldn't help but feel a mix of satisfaction and slight disbelief. "Well, that happened," muttered one of Macduff's soldiers, who was leaning heavily on his spear and looking around as if he wasn't quite sure whether to be proud of his role in history or embarrassed by the absurdity of it all. "Yes," Macduff replied, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It certainly did." Before he could savor the victory any longer, the sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. Malcolm, the rightful heir to the throne and all-around decent human being, appeared with a group of his own soldiers in tow. His face was a mixture of relief, fatigue, and the unmistakable look of someone who wasn't entirely sure what to do next. "Is it over?" Malcolm asked, his voice a little higher pitched than usual. "Quite over," Macduff replied, wiping his sword on what remained of Macbeth's royal cape. "I think we can officially say that your promotion has gone through." Malcolm let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Good," he muttered, "because honestly, I'm not sure how much more of this I could handle." The two men stood in silence for a moment, staring at the fallen tyrant who had once been their friend. There was a strange sense of finality in the air, but also a lingering unease, like the feeling you get when you leave the house and can't quite remember whether you locked the door. "What do we do now?" Malcolm asked quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Well," Macduff replied, his tone thoughtful, "I suppose you could start by giving a rousing speech. You know, something to inspire the troops and make everyone forget about that bit with the moving forest." Malcolm blinked. "Right," he muttered. "A speech, of course." He cleared his throat and stepped forward, raising his arms in what he hoped was a regal gesture. The surviving soldiers and lords turned to face him, their expressions ranging from hopeful to mildly skeptical. "People of Scotland," Malcolm began, his voice wavering slightly, "today we have, emerged victorious over tyranny." The crowd cheered half-heartedly, clearly expecting a bit more substance. Malcolm glanced at Macduff, who gave him an encouraging nod. "And, with the death of Macbeth," Malcolm continued, "we can now, look forward to a new era of peace and prosperity." There was a polite smattering of applause, though one of the soldiers coughed loudly enough to express his lack of confidence in the situation. "And, thank you all for your bravery," Malcolm finished lamely, lowering his arms and trying to maintain eye contact with the ground. "You've all done very well." There was a beat of awkward silence, and then Macduff took a step forward, clapping loudly. "Long live King Malcolm!" he called, his voice ringing out with far more enthusiasm than Malcolm's. The soldiers cheered, and the lords joined in, relieved that someone had at least pretended to know what was going on. Malcolm gave Macduff a grateful look, clearly making a mental note to hire a speechwriter as soon as he was crowned. As the cheering subsided and the soldiers began the laborious task of cleaning up the aftermath of the battle, Lady Macbeth wandered through the corridors of the castle, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. She was talking to herself, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the walls themselves were eavesdropping. "Out, damned spot," she muttered, rubbing her hands together as if trying to wash away an invisible stain. "Out, I say." Of course, the spot wasn't really there. It was more of an existential metaphor for her guilt and the cumulative weight of her increasingly questionable life choices. But it didn't stop her from scrubbing furiously at her hands, as if she were trying to clean the slate of her own conscience. A passing servant, who had the misfortune of hearing Lady Macbeth's ramblings, stopped in his tracks and glanced around nervously. He wasn't entirely sure what to do in this situation, so he opted for the tried-and-true tactic of pretending he hadn't heard a thing. "Out!" Lady Macbeth hissed, her voice rising in pitch. "Will these hands near be clean?" The servant cleared his throat awkwardly, taking a cautious step back. "My lady," he ventured tentatively. Lady Macbeth froze, her eyes wide and unseeing. For a moment, it seemed as if she was going to lash out, but then she simply shook her head and whispered, "What's done cannot be undone." The servant, sensing that this was his cue to exit, bowed quickly and hurried away, making a mental note to stay as far away from Lady Macbeth as humanly possible for the foreseeable future. Outside the castle, as the sun began to set, the three witches reappeared on their hilltop perch, watching the final stages of the battle unfold with the glee of theater critics at a particularly scandalous play. "Well, that was a bit anticlimactic," Aggie remarked, nibbling on a piece of jerky she had pilfered from one of the fallen soldiers. "Oh, I don't know," Hester replied, her voice laced with dark amusement. "The bit with the moving forest was a nice touch." The nameless witch, who was twirling a lock of her hair around her finger, grinned. "And Macduff's little not-born-of-a-woman revelation? A classic twist ending." Aggie chuckled, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I suppose it all worked out in the end." "Yes," Hester agreed, "though I must say I was expecting Macbeth to put up a bit more of a fight. He really went downhill fast." "Madness does that," the nameless witch observed, stretching her arms above her head. "It's like trying to ride a horse that's on fire. Eventually, you're going to get burned." They laughed softly, their voices carrying on the wind like whispers of fate. It had been a long and eventful journey, but they had done their part. Macbeth had been given the chance to choose his own destiny, and he had chosen poorly. "Well, ladies," Aggie said, rising to her feet, "I suppose it's time to move on. There are other kings to meddle with, other prophecies to deliver." Hester nodded, standing up and dusting off her cloak. "Indeed, I hear there's a king down south who's just begging for a good prophecy. Something about a lion and a snake, I think." The nameless witch grinned, adjusting the feathers in her hair. "Sounds promising. Let's go then." And with that, the three witches vanished into the mist, leaving behind the echoes of their laughter and the lingering sense that history had just repeated itself in the most predictable way possible. Back at the castle, Malcolm sat on the newly restored throne, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over him like an overly elaborate cape. He glanced around the empty throne room, wondering if this was really what he had wanted all along. "Well," he muttered to himself, "at least I'm not being haunted by ghosts, yet." As he pondered his future, Macduff entered the room, giving him an encouraging smile. "You'll be fine, Your Majesty," he said. "Just remember, avoid witches, keep an eye on the trees, and maybe don't murder anyone unless absolutely necessary." Malcolm chuckled weakly. "Good advice," he replied. "I'll keep that in mind." And so, as the castle began to settle into a new era, the Kingdom of Scotland breathed a collective sigh of relief. The tyrant had fallen, the rightful king had been restored, and everyone could finally get back to the simple pleasures of life, like avoiding supernatural prophecies and occasionally fighting off the English. But even as peace returned, there was a lingering sense that ambition and power were fickle companions, capable of turning even the most well-meaning of men into monsters. And somewhere in the dark corners of the world, the witches waited, ready to spin their next tale and watch the consequences unfold. After all, what's the point of having power if you can't mess with mortals every once in a while? And thus, the curtain closed on the tale of Macbeth, a story of ambition, madness, moving forests and ghosts with impeccable timing. A story that reminded everyone that trusting in prophecies delivered by cackling old women was generally a terrible idea. As the last echoes of laughter faded away, the kingdom settled into an uneasy peace, knowing that the wheel of fate would keep turning, and that somewhere a trio of witches were already planning their next great adventure. Chapter 10: A New Dawn. It was, by all accounts, a lovely morning in Scotland. The sun rose tentatively, as if checking to make sure the chaos of the previous days had finally calmed down. Birds chirped hesitantly, as though they too were waiting to see if any more ghosts or wandering forests were planning to make an appearance. The castle of Dunsinane, now sporting a few new battle scars and a rather embarrassing history of botanical invaders, stood quiet and dignified, like an old warrior pretending it hadn't just been thoroughly humiliated by a cleverly disguised army. Inside the castle, the mood was cautiously optimistic. Malcolm was now firmly established as king, which was a nice change from the previous reign, during which the castle's HR department had given up on writing official memos and just started circulating obituaries. King Malcolm, still adjusting to the crown and all the paperwork that came with it, sat in the throne room trying very hard to look like a man with a plan. He wore the royal robes with the slightly uncomfortable air of someone who had accidentally picked up the wrong dry cleaning order. "What now?" Malcolm muttered under his breath as he stared at a stack of documents on the table before him. Apparently, being king involved a lot more administrative work than he had anticipated. Taxes, land disputes, grain shortages, it was all very mundane and very unlike the heroic ballads he had grown up hearing. Macduff entered the room, smiling in that reassuring way people do when they're hiding the fact that they've just had a near-fatal encounter with a pigeon. "Good morning, Your Majesty," he said cheerfully, trying not to look too smug about having survived the whole Witch Forest sword fight debacle. "Good morning, Macduff," Malcolm replied, rubbing his eyes. "Have you come to add more paperwork to this mountain?" "Not this time," Macduff replied, holding up his hands. "I just came to see how you were settling in." Malcolm sighed, staring at the pile of royal responsibilities. "I'm starting to think that maybe being king isn't as glamorous as everyone says." Macduff chuckled. "You'll get used to it," he said. "Besides, it's not like you have to deal with any more witches." "True," Malcolm agreed, though his tone suggested that he wasn't entirely convinced. After everything that had happened, he couldn't help but feel like the witches were lurking just out of sight, ready to throw another cryptic prophecy his way when he least expected it. "Speaking of which," Malcolm added, a hint of nervousness creeping into his voice, "we are sure that they're gone, right?" "Absolutely," Macduff replied with far more confidence than he actually felt. "They've probably moved on to another unsuspecting kingdom by now." Malcolm nodded, looking marginally reassured. "Good," he muttered, "because I don't think I could handle another prophecy right now." As if on cue, the doors to the throne room creaked open, and in walked an old woman wearing a feathered cloak and carrying an unnecessarily large walking stick. The guards, who had apparently failed to recognize her as a red flag, watched her approach with polite confusion. Macduff and Malcolm exchanged a look that was somewhere between "you've got to be kidding me" and "run for your life." The old woman stopped in front of the throne, giving a deep, dramatic bow. "Your Majesty," she intoned, her voice dripping with mystery and menace, "I bring—" "Nope," Malcolm interrupted, holding up his hand. "Not today. Not in the mood." The old woman blinked, clearly taken aback. "But not interested," Malcolm said firmly, waving his hand as if shooing away an overly persistent street performer. "No prophecies, no curses, no cryptic riddles. But I have. Unless you have a recipe for haggis or a decent joke, I'm gonna have to ask you to leave," Malcolm continued, his voice growing more exasperated by the second. The old woman frowned, clearly unaccustomed to being dismissed so casually. "You're making a terrible mistake," she warned ominously. "Trust me," Malcolm replied, his voice flat. "I've already made plenty of those. This isn't one of them." Macduff, who was trying very hard not to burst out laughing, gave the guards a quick nod. The guards, finally catching on to the fact that this was not the right time for unsolicited prophecies, escorted the old woman out of the throne room, muttering apologies as they went. "Well," Macduff said after a moment of stunned silence, "that was unexpected." "I'm so tired of witches," Malcolm muttered, slumping back in his chair. As the days passed and the castle began to settle into a new routine, Malcolm slowly grew more comfortable in his role as king. He wasn't perfect, of course. There were a few minor diplomatic incidents involving misplaced royal seals and one regrettable incident with a delegation from Norway. But overall, he was doing his best to restore order and stability to the kingdom. Lady Macbeth, on the other hand, had not fared as well. Her guilt had weighed heavily on her, and the strain of trying to keep her increasingly unhinged husband from completely losing it had taken its toll. She spent most of her days wandering the castle in a daze, muttering to herself and scrubbing her hands as if she were trying to erase something that no amount of soap could wash away. One morning, as Malcolm was preparing to review a particularly tedious land dispute, a servant rushed into the room, looking pale and shaken. "Your Majesty," the servant stammered, "it's Lady Macbeth." Malcolm set down the parchment, a sinking feeling settling in his stomach. "What about her?" he asked quietly. The servant hesitated, clearly unsure how to break the news. "She's passed away, sire. They found her this morning." Malcolm closed his eyes, a deep sigh escaping his lips. He hadn't known Lady Macbeth well, but he had seen the toll that her ambition and guilt had taken on her. She had been a formidable woman, driven by a ruthless determination that had ultimately led her down a dark path. "Thank you," Malcolm said softly, dismissing the servant with a nod. As the servant left, Macduff entered the room, his expression somber. "Is it true?" Macduff asked quietly. Malcolm nodded, his face etched with sadness. "Yes," he replied. "She's gone." There was a heavy silence, the weight of all that had happened hanging in the air between them. After a moment, Malcolm let out a bitter chuckle. "You know," he said, his voice tinged with dark humor, "I always thought being king would be different. Less madness and more merriment?" Macduff suggested with a wry smile. "Something like that," Malcolm muttered. "It's all just so heavy." Macduff nodded, understanding all too well. "It's the nature of power," he said quietly. "Heavy is the head that wears the crown and all that." "Right," Malcolm replied, rubbing his temples. I thought once this was all over, things would be simpler." "Things are never simple," Macduff replied. "Not in this kingdom, anyway." Malcolm let out a weary sigh. "What do we do now?" "Well," Macduff said thoughtfully, "we rebuild, we rule, and we try not to let the witches back in." Malcolm chuckled, though the sound was more tired than amused. "Good advice," he muttered. "I think I'll take it." And so, as the kingdom of Scotland began to heal from the wounds of tyranny and madness, life slowly returned to something resembling normalcy. Malcolm proved to be a fair and reasonable king, despite his occasional penchant for rambling speeches and an irrational fear of oak trees. Macduff remained by his side, offering sage advice and the occasional reality check whenever Malcolm started to drift off into existential musings. The witches, meanwhile, had indeed moved on to new pastures, or rather, new castles. They had heard rumors of a particularly ambitious prince down south who had been dealing with some ghost problems, and they couldn't resist the opportunity to stir the pot a little. "Another prophecy?" Aggie asked, twirling her walking stick with practiced nonchalance. "Why not?" Hester replied, her grin widening. "After all, someone's got to keep things interesting." And so, as they disappeared into the mist once more, they left behind a kingdom that had learned a valuable lesson about ambition, power, and the dangers of trusting old women who enjoyed brewing suspicious potions. As for Scotland, it carried on as kingdoms do, imperfectly, messily, and with a fair amount of grumbling from its citizens. There were still battles to fight, disputes to settle, and the occasional ghost to exorcise, but for the most part, life went on. And in the end, that was all anyone could really ask for. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this retelling, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss new stories. We bring classic plays, fairy tales, and timeless stories to life with a fresh twist. And if you know someone who'd enjoy these reimagined tales, please share the channel with them. Your support helps us continue to grow and bring more stories to you.